Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this, where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. $5 million buys a beautiful marina, I said, watching Whitney Harrow sink ankle-deep into black mud. It just doesn't buy the water beneath it. At 6 that morning, 3 television crews were waiting for Crown Water Marina's grand reopening. They expected sunlight flashing across polished boats, champagne on the restaurant deck, and Whitney smiling beneath a banner that read Tennessee's premier lakefront experience. Instead, the lake was gone. Not all of it. The old river channel still cut a dark ribbon through Mercer Lake's center, exactly where it had flowed before my grandfather built the dam. But the eastern bay had emptied overnight, exposing nearly 40 acres of mud, broken reeds, and pale clay. That was where Whitney had built her marina. 180 slips sat stranded above the lakebed. Floating docks rested crooked in the sludge. Steel pilings rose 12 feet into the morning mist like the ribs of something dead. An 80-foot houseboat leaned against its mooring lines while its owner stood on shore in bedroom slippers, staring at it without blinking. The smell hit next. Wet earth. Algae. Rotting weeds. Diesel from the generators Whitney's crew had dragged down to the shoreline. Then came the screaming. What did you do? Whitney charged across the grass in an ivory pantsuit and cream-colored heels. She made it 3 steps beyond the last section of pavement before one shoe disappeared into the mud. Her arms flew outward. A cameraman caught everything. The HOA president who had spent 4 months calling me an unstable obstructionist was now standing barefoot beside a $5 million boardwalk that no longer reached water. I watched from the concrete platform above the dam. The steel control wheel was cold beneath my gloved hand. Inside the gatehouse, gauges trembled softly. 12 feet below me, water rushed through the outlet conduit with a deep mechanical roar I could feel through my boots. Beside me stood Maeve Sutton from the State Water Resources Office, 2 county deputies, and a binder containing every permit, inspection report, evacuation notice, and court order required for the drawdown. Nothing about that morning was accidental. Nothing was illegal. Whitney pointed toward me. He sabotaged the lake. Arrest him. Sheriff Amos Bellamy looked at the authorization clipped to his board. Mr. Mercer is conducting state-approved dam maintenance. This is community property. No, ma'am, Maeve said. The marina is attached to private lakebed owned by the Mercer Water Trust. Whitney's face changed. Not fear yet. Fear comes after powerful people understand the truth. This was confusion, the first crack in a person who had spent years believing official letterhead could turn desire into ownership. Behind her, the television cameras began panning across the exposed lakebed. That was when the mud revealed more than stranded docks. Concrete footings extended beyond the permitted construction line. Electrical cables ran through unmarked trenches. A fuel pipe disappeared beneath a cracked retaining wall. Storm drains poured directly into the basin without filtration. Everything Whitney had hidden beneath 12 feet of water was now lying in open daylight. She looked back at the cameras, then at me. You planned this. I closed the inspection binder. No, I said. Your engineers planned it. I just lowered the water far enough for everyone to see. For months earlier, Whitney had stood on this same shoreline and told me nobody owned water. She was right about one thing. I didn't own every drop. But I owned the dam, the lakebed, the outlet gates, and the legal responsibility to operate them safely. More importantly, I owned the brass key in my pocket, the same key my father had used for 31 years before Crown Water Ridge existed. Whitney had built a marina on my private lake, locked me away from its controls, and sold permanent water access she had no authority to promise. By sunrise, her $5 million investment had become the most expensive boardwalk in Tennessee. But to understand why I drained Mercer Lake, you need to understand what she built over, what she concealed beneath the water, and why my father once warned me never to use the lake to punish people. Use it to reveal the truth, he had said. That morning, the truth was rising out of the mud. The brass key had belonged to my grandfather before it belonged to my father, and neither man ever treated it like a symbol of power. To them, it was a responsibility. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 8 years old the first time my father let me hold that key. It felt too heavy for something small enough to disappear inside his fist. We were standing in the dam control room before sunrise. The concrete walls sweated with condensation. Hydraulic oil, wet stone, and cold metal filled the air. Somewhere beneath our boots, water pressed against the gates with enough force to tear trees from the ground. My father placed my hand on the steel control wheel. Feel that vibration? I nodded. That's the lake asking whether we know what we're doing. Mercer Lake covered 138 acres in the hills of eastern Tennessee. From the surface, it looked natural. Cedar trees bending over quiet coves, base breaking the water at dusk, fog settling across the shoreline like breath on glass. But the lake had been built. My grandfather, Henry Mercer, constructed the dam in 1962 after 3 floods destroyed farms along Bell Creek. He spent 2 years moving earth, pouring concrete, and negotiating water rights with families downstream. The dam stopped the flooding. It also created irrigation storage for 6 farms, a dry season reserve for the county fire department, and a wetland habitat near the southern basin. Our family owned the lakebed, the dam, the gatehouse, and the maintenance road. The Mercer Water Trust controlled how the system operated, but that control came with rules. We couldn't simply raise or lower the water whenever we felt like it. Every adjustment affected someone. Too much water could flood the lower valley. Too little could strand fish, expose unstable banks, or leave farmers without irrigation. My father recorded every change in thick green ledgers he stored inside a steel cabinet. Date, rainfall, gate position, water temperature, downstream flow. He wrote everything by hand. When I was 12, I asked why he bothered recording changes nobody would ever question. He looked at me over his glasses. People only call records unnecessary until somebody lies. That sentence stayed with me. So did the red and white gauge posts along the shoreline. Each painted stripe marked 1 foot of depth. My father taught me to read them before he taught me to drive. At full pool, the eastern bay reached 10 feet deep. At maintenance level, it became wet clay and cattail roots. That bay had once been a low pasture before the dam went in. My grandfather's original photographs showed cattle standing where Whitney would later build her luxury marina. The old river channel was different. It ran nearly 30 feet deep through the center of the lake and held water even during major drawdowns. That channel was why we could lower the eastern basin without draining Mercer Lake completely. My father performed the last deep drawdown 17 years before Crown Water Ridge existed. He inspected the outlet gates, repaired concrete along the spillway, and cleared roots from the drainage channels. I remembered walking beside him across the exposed lakebed. Mud pulled at my boots. Small fish flashed inside shallow pools. The smell of wet leaves and mineral-rich clay clung to our clothes for days. Near the old fence line, he stopped and pointed toward the empty eastern bay. One day, somebody will see flat shoreline and think it belongs to them, he said. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. Before he died, he placed the brass key in my palm and closed my fingers around it. Never use water to punish people, he told me. Water doesn't understand anger. Then he looked toward the lake. Use it to reveal what they built where it never belonged. For years, I thought he was teaching me about engineering. 4 months before I lowered Mercer Lake, Whitney Harrow taught me he had also been warning me about people. Whitney Harrow didn't begin by building a marina. She began by selling a lake she didn't own. The first advertisement appeared in my mailbox on a Thursday afternoon. Thick paper, gold lettering. A photograph of Mercer Lake taken from the western ridge at sunset. Crown Water Ridge. Private waterfront living. Permanent lake access. I stood beside the mailbox while cicadas rattled in the trees and read those last 3 words twice. Permanent lake access. Nobody from the HOA had called me. Nobody had asked about the Mercer Water Trust, the seasonal drawdown schedule, or the restrictions recorded against the lakebed. They had simply printed ownership onto a brochure. Crown Water Ridge sat along the eastern shoreline, where a developer had divided an old cattle farm into 86 oversized lots. The houses were stone, glass, and cedar. Every driveway curved. Every lawn sloped toward the water. Whitney lived in the largest house at the top of the hill. She was 53, blonde, polished, and always dressed as if a camera might appear without warning. Her white Range Rover carried a real estate license plate and smelled faintly of leather, perfume, and new money. She called herself a lake lifestyle specialist. The lake had never heard of her. 2 days after the brochure arrived, Whitney invited me to a community vision meeting at the Crown Water Clubhouse. A 12-foot rendering covered the ballroom wall. It showed floating docks stretching across the eastern bay, 180 boat slips, a fuel station, a restaurant with outdoor seating, a yacht club, a wedding pavilion built over the water. At the bottom, in elegant silver letters, were the words Crown Water Marina, opening summer. I stopped beneath the rendering. Who approved this? Whitney turned from a group of investors and gave me the smile she used in property listings. Evan, I'm glad you came. Who approved construction on the lakebed? She lifted one hand toward the room. We've secured all necessary community approvals. That isn't what I asked. The conversations around us softened. Whitney guided me toward a display table covered with contracts and architectural drawings. Her nails were the exact shade of pale pink used in the Marina logo. The shoreline belongs to Crown Water Ridge, she said. The shoreline does. Her smile remained. The community has enjoyed the lake for years. They've looked at it for years. Water isn't private property. I unfolded the survey map she had placed beneath the rendering. The water moves, I said. The ground under it doesn't. The eastern bay, including every planned piling, belonged to the Mercer Water Trust. The HOA owned land above the full pool elevation. Nothing below it. Whitney tapped a newly colored section of the map. Blue shading covered the entire bay and connected it to Crown Water's common area. That's not a recorded survey, I said. It reflects modern use. It reflects a blue marker. Her smile finally cooled. She explained that the marina would increase property values, create jobs, and make Mercer Lake a destination. Slip memberships had already sold. The restaurant had signed a 15-year lease. A lender had approved nearly $5 million based on projected access fees. They were selling weddings, gasoline, boat storage, and permanent water rights before driving the first piling. Cancel it, I said. Whitney glanced toward the investors. That would be financially irresponsible. It would be legal. She stepped closer. Her perfume carried something floral and sharp. The community doesn't need one man's permission to improve its own shoreline. I looked back at the rendering. The artist had drawn deep blue water beneath every dock. Sailboats floated where my grandfather's cattle once stood. Not one red and white gauge post appeared in the picture. Whitney wasn't building a marina. She was building a promise that Mercer Lake would remain full forever. And she had borrowed $5 million against that promise without asking the only person responsible for keeping it. The first steel piling went into Mercer Lake at 6:12 on a Monday morning. I heard it from the dam house. A hydraulic hammer struck metal with a sound like a church bell being dropped down a mine shaft. The impact rolled across the water, rattled the gatehouse windows, and sent a flock of herons lifting from the southern marsh. I drove toward the eastern bay. By the time I reached the maintenance road, a black security gate blocked the entrance. It hadn't been there Friday. 2 stone pillars stood on either side, still wet with mortar. A polished sign between them read Restricted Marina Infrastructure, Authorized Personnel Only. The road beneath that gate belonged to the Mercer Water Trust. So did the drainage ditch they had filled with crushed limestone to make room for a guard booth. A man in a gray uniform stepped out and raised one hand. This area is closed. I maintain the dam. You'll need HOA authorization. I looked past him. Russell Harrow's construction crew had spread across the shoreline. Excavators scraped cedar roots from the bank. A crane lowered steel pilings into the eastern bay. Workers in orange vests stood on barges above land my family had owned since before the lake existed. Call Whitney, I said. He touched the radio on his shoulder. She's expecting you. That should have warned me. Whitney arrived with Sheriff Amos Bellamy and 2 deputies behind her. She wore white slacks, mirrored sunglasses, and the same controlled smile she had used beside the marina rendering. Evan, she said, you cannot keep disrupting a permitted project. You put a gate across my maintenance road. The HOA secured an easement. No, you printed one. I pulled the recorded trust map from my truck. The red boundary line ran beneath the guard booth, around the bay, and straight through the construction zone. Whitney barely glanced at it. Our attorneys have reviewed the issue. A deputy stepped between us. "Mr. Mercer, there's a temporary order preventing interference with construction." "I'm not interfering. I'm inspecting my dam." Whitney pointed toward the gatehouse behind me. "This is now an active commercial site. Your unsupervised access creates a safety risk." The words were absurd enough to make me laugh. She had built on my lake, blocked my road, and declared me dangerous for trying to reach the machinery that controlled the water beneath her project. Sheriff Bellamy shifted his weight. "Let the court sort it out, Evan. Water doesn't wait for court." Whitney's smile tightened. Neither did the weather. That night, thunder moved over the ridge like heavy furniture being dragged across the sky. Rain struck the roof in sheets. By midnight, Mercer Lake had risen 8 inches. At 1:40 a.m., the high water alarm on my phone began screaming. I checked the remote sensors. The main outlet was functioning, but runoff from Crown Water Ridge was entering faster than predicted. Their crew had narrowed the emergency spill channel with gravel, concrete forms, and stacked lumber. If the rain continued, water could overtop the unfinished bank near the marina. I called Bellamy. No answer. I called Whitney. Voicemail. So I took the old forestry trail around the western slope. Branches scraped both sides of my truck. Mud pulled at the tires. Lightning exposed the trees in white flashes, and the smell of wet cedar pushed through the vents. I parked above the gatehouse and climbed down on foot. Rain stung my face. Water rushed through the blocked spill channel, carrying boards, plastic wrapping, and fresh soil toward the dam. The brass key opened the control room door. Inside, warning lights painted the concrete walls red. I adjusted the auxiliary gate 6 inches. The machinery groaned beneath my hands. Water moved through the conduit. The lake stopped rising 11 minutes later. At dawn, deputies found me inside. Whitney stood behind them, dry beneath a black umbrella. She didn't thank me for preventing damage to her marina. She accused me of sabotage. As they escorted me away, I looked across the eastern bay at the new docks floating above the swollen water. That was when I understood. Whitney wasn't merely stealing access to Mercer Lake. She was preventing me from keeping it safe. The judge called it preserving the status quo. What it preserved was Whitney's marina. 3 days after the storm, I stood in county court with dried mud still trapped in the seams of my boots. My attorney placed the Mercer Water Trust, the original lakebed survey, and photographs of the blocked spill channel in front of the judge. Whitney's lawyers brought architectural renderings, construction schedules, and sworn statements claiming I had entered a secured work zone and manipulated dam equipment without authorization. Without authorization. I almost laughed. The brass key in my pocket had opened that control room for 3 generations. Their lead attorney described the marina as a nearly completed public investment supporting jobs, tourism, and local property values. Stopping construction, he said, would create catastrophic financial harm. My attorney pointed toward the photographs. So would a compromised spillway. The judge studied both sides for less than 10 minutes. Then he issued a temporary order. Construction could continue. The lake level had to remain unchanged. I was prohibited from operating the gates except during an officially declared emergency or with written approval from the court. Whitney walked out smiling. I walked out legally forbidden from maintaining my own dam. Within 2 weeks, Crown Water Marina opened. Music carried across the lake every evening. White lights wrapped around the docks. Boats arrived on polished trailers while valets directed traffic along the maintenance road I was no longer allowed to use. Whitney held the ribbon-cutting ceremony on a Saturday. She wore a white dress and stood beneath a blue banner reading a new ERA for Mercer Lake. The name bothered me more than it should have. Not because my family owned the lakebed, because she had erased every reason the lake existed. No mention of flood control, no mention of irrigation, no mention of the farms downstream or the fire reserve or the wetland habitat. To Whitney, the lake was scenery with a membership fee. A local reporter found me outside the security gate. "Mrs. Harrow says you're threatening hundreds of families by trying to drain the lake." "I'm trying to inspect the dam." "Do you intend to lower the water?" "Maintenance requires changing water levels." That sentence appeared on the evening news beneath the headline "Private Owner Threatens Community Marina." Whitney gave her interview from the restaurant deck with champagne glasses sparkling behind her. She called me bitter, unstable, a former engineer unable to accept progress. Then the fines began. $5,000 for interfering with HOA operations. $10,000 for unauthorized gate access. $25,000 for alleged damage caused when I opened the auxiliary outlet during the storm. The HOA knew I wasn't a member. That didn't stop them from mailing notices. The county building office refused to investigate the blocked spillway because the Marina's permit showed no work inside the dam easement. When I asked to see the site plan, the eastern bay had been labeled Crown Water Common Water Feature. Someone had renamed my lake on a permit application. By late June, the marina was full. 143 boats occupied the slips. The floating restaurant booked weddings through the next summer. Whitney sold permanent access packages to new homeowners for $40,000 each. Every sale made the lie heavier. I stood outside the gate one evening as fireworks exploded above the water. Red light moved across the docks. Music shook the cedar branches. The smell of grilled steak and gasoline drifted over the fence. People applauded while Whitney raised a glass from the restaurant balcony. Behind me, the red and white gauge post showed the lake 2 inches above normal. I could not lower it. I could not inspect beneath the docks. I could not clear the spill channel without risking contempt of court. For the first time in my life, I owned Mercer Lake only on paper. Whitney controlled the road, the shoreline, the cameras, the permits, and the story everyone had chosen to believe. She had locked me away from the water my family was legally responsible for protecting. And until I found something stronger than ownership, the law was helping her do it. The thing stronger than ownership was responsibility. Gordon Pike arrived at my house 2 mornings after the fireworks carrying a dented green toolbox. He had managed Mercer Dam with my father for 23 years. At 71, he still walked like every step had been measured against a blueprint. Without saying hello, he placed the box on my kitchen table. Your father told me to keep this until somebody confused a full lake with a permanent lake. The latches opened with a metallic snap. Inside were rolled engineering drawings, inspection photographs, handwritten flow tables, and a topographic map sealed beneath yellowed plastic. The paper smelled of dust, machine oil, and the damp concrete of the old gatehouse. Gordon flattened the map beneath 2 coffee mugs. It showed Bell Creek Valley before 1962. No lake. No marina. The eastern bay was a shallow cattle pasture crossed by an old fence line. The original creek channel curved nearly 400 yards west of it, cut deep between 2 ridges. Gordon traced the contour lines with 1 cracked fingernail. At full pool, Whitney has 10 feet under those docks. And at maintenance level, nothing but mud. I looked closer. My grandfather had designed Mercer Lake with a 12-foot operational drawdown range. The deep channel would retain enough water for fish refuge and downstream release, but the eastern basin would empty completely. That wasn't a loophole. It was the original operating plan. Every 7 to 10 years, the lake was supposed to be lowered for gate inspection, spillway repair, shoreline stabilization, and removal of invasive growth. My father had postponed the last major drawdown because nesting herons had established themselves near the southern wetland. The authority to lower it had never expired. The need had only accumulated. Gordon handed me a red ledger. My father's final inspection entry was dated 6 months before he died. Main gate seal showing age. Full structural inspection required at next safe drawdown. 17 years had passed. The marina pilings now blocked access to the exact section that needed inspection. I called Maeve Sutton at the Tennessee Water Resources office. She met us at the western overlook that afternoon. Wind pushed small waves against the rocks below, while Whitney's restaurant music drifted across the water. Maeve studied the old plans, then compared them with recent aerial photographs. Her expression hardened. They built over the inspection corridor. They had a county permit. The county-approved docks, she said. Not permanent obstructions inside a regulated dam maintenance zone. She spent the next week reviewing rainfall records, gate data, spillway photographs, and the altered construction plans. Her report was 48 pages. The conclusion fit into 1 sentence. Mercer Dam required an immediate controlled drawdown. The reasons were worse than I expected. The blocked spill channel reduced emergency capacity. Steel pilings prevented underwater inspection. Concrete footings may have penetrated the protective clay layer above the old pasture. Fuel lines and electrical conduits crossed areas never approved for commercial infrastructure. The lake had to be lowered 12 feet. Not to punish Whitney. To determine what she had built and whether it had damaged the system holding back millions of gallons of water. Maeve also found something buried in the Marina permit. Whitney's engineers had listed the eastern basin as permanent navigable water. They submitted summer photographs, but omitted every historical drawdown record. The lender, restaurant operator, and slip buyers had been promised stable water levels based on that description. Whitney had not merely ignored the truth. She had financed the marina by hiding it. I stood beside the red and white gauge post that evening, watching boats move through golden water. Laughter carried from the restaurant. Dock lights flickered on one row at a time. For months, Whitney had acted as if her marina created the lake's value. The old map proved the opposite. Her marina existed only because my father, and later I, had kept the eastern pasture underwater. The $5 million project wasn't built beside a permanent harbor. It was built above a maintenance zone that had been waiting 17 years to become mud again. The drawdown notice went out on a Monday morning. Certified mail, email, hand delivery, public posting at the marina gate. 12 feet over 10 hours. Every boat had to leave the eastern basin by 8 p.m. Friday. Whitney called it intimidation before the envelopes were cold. She stood on the restaurant deck that afternoon with 2 local reporters, holding my notice between manicured fingers as if it smelled bad. Mr. Mercer is attempting to destroy a community asset through technical harassment, she said. Crown Water Marina will remain open. The cameras caught her tearing the notice in half. What they didn't see was the court order folded inside her handbag. Maeve's emergency inspection report had changed everything. The judge who once froze the lake level lifted his restriction within 48 hours. The state approved the drawdown, the downstream reservoir confirmed capacity, and wildlife officers established protected refuge pools along the old creek channel. We prepared for every risk. Water rescue teams marked the deep route out of the marina. Tow operators waited beside the launch ramp. Engineers installed temporary gauges below the dam. I sent hourly flow projections to 6 downstream farms and the county fire department. Nobody would be surprised. Nobody would be endangered. At least, that was the plan. Thursday evening, Claudia Wynn pulled into my driveway. She served as Crown Water's treasurer and had spent 3 years voting beside Whitney. That night, she looked 20 years older. Her hands shook as she passed me a flash drive. She knew, Claudia said. Inside were emails between Whitney, Russell, and the marina lender. One message included the original Mercer Water Trust survey. Another warned that the eastern bay could become exposed during maintenance drawdowns. Whitney's reply was 9 words. Don't include that in the investor package. It creates doubt. She had known before the first piling entered the lake. Claudia also showed me the message Whitney sent residents after receiving our evacuation order. Routine water level fluctuation. No boat removal required. Whitney wasn't merely refusing to cooperate. She was trapping her own residents inside the lie because empty slips would frighten investors arriving for Friday night's second grand opening festival. By noon Friday, banners covered the clubhouse. A jazz band tested speakers on the restaurant deck. Caterers stacked champagne beneath white tents. Dozens of boats remained tied to the docks. I drove to the marina with Maeve, Sheriff Bellamy, and officers from the state boating agency. The security gate stayed closed. Whitney stood behind it in a navy dress, smiling for arriving investors. You have no authority to interrupt a private event, she said. Maeve handed the sheriff the enforcement order. The chain came off 3 minutes later. Boating officers moved slip by slip, showing owners the real notice Whitney had hidden. Anger replaced confusion. Engine started. Mooring lines slapped against wet wood. The marina filled with exhaust, shouting, and the hollow knock of boats pulling away. Whitney tried to stop them. She stood at the fuel dock, demanding residents remain calm and leave their vessels where they were. Nobody listened. By sunset, 139 boats had reached deep water or been removed by trailer. 4 remained. All belonged to Whitney, Russell, or the marina company. At 7:42 p.m., the tow captain offered one final removal. Whitney refused. Those boats stay, she said. The lake stays. I looked at the red and white gauge post behind her. Full pool. For the moment. At 8 o'clock, the boating officers cleared the eastern basin. At 9:15, the final safety inspection ended. At 10:30, Maeve signed the operational release. Near midnight, I stood inside the gatehouse with my father's brass key resting beside the red ledger. Whitney's festival lights shimmered across the water. Music still played from the stranded restaurant. She believed the lake was too large, too valuable, and too public for one man to change. At exactly 12 a.m., I placed both hands on the steel wheel. Then I opened the first gate. At midnight, the lake still looked permanent. Moonlight stretched across the eastern bay. The marina lights shimmered in long gold lines, and Whitney's four boats rocked gently beside the restaurant deck as if nothing could touch them. I turned the steel wheel 1/4 rotation. Deep beneath the gatehouse, metal groaned against water pressure. The sound traveled through the concrete and into my hands. A green indicator light flickered on. Gate 1 open. Water entered the outlet conduit with a low roar. Maeve watched the downstream gauge while Gordon recorded the exact time in my father's red ledger. 12 a.m. Initial release, controlled. For the first 30 minutes, nothing changed at the marina. That was the deceptive thing about moving millions of gallons. The lake did not collapse. It obeyed gravity 1 inch at a time. At 12:47, the full pool mark disappeared above the waterline. At 1:30, the current strengthened through the old river channel. Below the dam, the conservation reservoir accepted the flow exactly as projected. No flooding, no erosion, no danger, only movement. The gatehouse smelled of hydraulic oil and cold coffee. Pumps hummed behind the wall. Every 15 minutes, Maeve checked oxygen levels, downstream velocity, and pressure readings. At 2:10, we opened the second gate. The roar doubled. Across the eastern bay, the first floating dock settled lower than its access ramp. Mooring ropes tightened. Metal cleats creaked in the darkness. At 3 o'clock, the marina touched bottom. A row of white flotation blocks pressed into wet clay. The docks stopped descending with the water and began resting on the lakebed. Whitney's largest boat leaned 3 degrees toward port, then 5, then 8. The hull never struck rock. There was no crash. Just the slow, humiliating angle of something expensive discovering it had been built in the wrong place. By 4:20, the floating restaurant no longer floated. Its support pontoons rested in black mud while the hinged walkway rose behind it like a drawbridge. Glasses slid from an outdoor table and shattered one after another. The sound carried across the emptying bay. At 5:10, the lake began revealing what Whitney had hidden. First came the concrete. Footings stretched nearly 40 feet beyond the approved construction boundary. Steel pilings had been driven through the protective clay layer Gordon warned about. Orange electrical cables lay inside shallow trenches without conduit. Then the fuel line appeared. It ran from the shoreline tank beneath the main dock, joined by fittings never shown on the permit plans. A dark stain marked the mud beneath one connection. May photographed everything. So did the state inspectors waiting along the bank. The lower the water fell, the larger the violations became. 3 unauthorized storm drains emptied directly into the basin. Construction debris had been buried beneath the restaurant. Broken concrete, treated lumber, plastic wrapping, and 2 rusted fuel drums rested where blue water had concealed them. At 5:45, the eastern bay was no longer a harbor. It was the pasture shown on my grandfather's map. Fence posts emerged from the mud in a crooked line. Tree stumps appeared beneath the stranded docks. The old creek channel remained full in the distance, dark and safe, carrying water toward the center of Mercer Lake. 12 feet down, exactly as designed. At 5:58, headlights swept across the hillside. Whitney's Range Rover stopped near the marina entrance, followed by 2 television vans. She stepped onto the grass in an ivory suit, expecting cameras, investors, and polished water. Instead, she smelled mud. She saw the tilted boats. Then she saw the evidence spread across the exposed lakebed. Whitney ran toward the docks, lost one heel, and began screaming my name. I stood on the dam with the state authorization in one hand and my father's brass key in the other. Behind me, the outlet gates continued their controlled release. In front of me, $5 million of lies stood stranded in morning light. Whitney had spent months hiding the truth underwater. All I had done was lower the lake until it could no longer stay buried. Whitney's marina did not collapse when the water disappeared. Her story did. By 8 that morning, state inspectors were walking across the exposed lakebed in rubber boots. Yellow evidence flags appeared beside the fuel line, the buried construction debris, and the concrete footings driven through the protective clay layer. Television crews filmed everything. The polished restaurant, the stranded boats, The storm drains emptying directly into black mud. Whitney stood near the shoreline with one bare foot and one ruined heel, telling reporters the drawdown was an act of revenge. Then Maeve opened the inspection binder. Every warning Whitney had received was inside. Certified delivery receipts, court orders, engineering reports, boat removal deadlines, her email telling residents that no evacuation was necessary, and the original Mercer Water Trust survey she had ordered removed from the investor package. The cameras turned toward her. This time, Whitney had nowhere to redirect them. The lender froze the Marina's accounts before noon. By the following week, Crown Water's $5 million loan was in default because the HOA had never owned permanent access to the water supporting the project. Russell's construction company lost its state license after investigators confirmed that his crews had altered drainage routes, buried fuel equipment, and built beyond every approved boundary. Whitney resigned as HOA president 3 days before the board could remove her. It did not protect her. State prosecutors opened investigations into permit fraud, bank misrepresentation, misuse of HOA funds, and concealment of safety warnings. Claudia Wynn cooperated fully and turned over the financial records Whitney had kept outside the official accounting system. The marina had been funded partly through special assessments that residents had been told were for shoreline safety. Instead, their money had paid for champagne events, marketing campaigns, and contracts awarded to Russell's company. The residents were furious. I did not blame them. Most had purchased homes believing the lake access was legal. They had trusted brochures, closing documents, and the woman standing behind the HOA seal. Whitney had used them as customers when she needed money and as shields when she needed sympathy. I refused to punish them for believing her. Under a court-approved cleanup agreement, the marina company's insurance and remaining assets paid to remove the illegal structures. Workers dismantled the restaurant, pulled the steel pilings, excavated contaminated soil, and reopened the emergency spill channel. I watched every load leave. The eastern basin slowly returned to the shape shown on my grandfather's map. A pasture beneath a lake. Nothing more. Nothing less. When the inspection ended, I closed the outlet gates in stages. Water returned slowly through Bell Creek. First it filled the old river channel. Then it spread across the lower basin, covering the fence posts, the clay, and the scars left by the marina. It took weeks. That was important. Justice had happened overnight. Restoration required patience. Crown Water Ridge formed a new voluntary association with open meetings, published accounts, and rotating leadership. Later, the residents approached me about building a small non-commercial dock in a deeper section of the lake. We reviewed the survey together. They asked permission. That changed everything. The new dock held 12 boats, no fuel tanks, no restaurant, and no promise that the water would remain at one level forever. Every agreement stated clearly that Mercer Lake was a working flood control reservoir subject to maintenance drawdowns. On the morning the lake reached normal pool, I walked into the gatehouse carrying my father's red ledger. The concrete walls smelled of cold stone and hydraulic oil. Sunlight touched the brass key as I hung it beside the control panel. Across the water, families stood on the new dock while children watched bass break the surface. No champagne, no television cameras, no one pretending the lake belonged to them. Near the maintenance road stood a new sign made from the metal face of Whitney's old marina advertisement. Private lake. Water level subject to owner-controlled maintenance. I could still see faint gold lettering beneath the paint where her $5 million promise had once been. My father had warned me never to use water to punish people. I hadn't. I lowered it safely, legally, and only long enough for the truth to appear. Whitney thought power meant controlling what everyone could see. She learned too late that the lake had been hiding the evidence for her. All I did was let the mud tell the truth.